morning, students. I'm going to record this, but I don't know when you'll see it because I don't have internet. I will try to go maybe somewhere where I can find some internet and load it up, but if you're like me, you might not have internet at your home. What I plan to do is lecture on this chapter in increments of 15-minute clips because the camera is turning off more than I like. And I'm going to develop a test, but it's going to be one that involves doing an activity and doing some writing this time around versus a multiple choice test. So let's get started. I'm going to start my timer on my phone so that I don't end up lecturing to an empty room, if you will. So this is chapter 11 in our textbook, and it is alcohol, the most common drug of abuse, or substance use and related disorders and crises. So I'm mainly going to be talking about crisis intervention with addiction and relating that to a client who maybe is living with addiction and is in a crisis, or a family member who is being involved with a crisis as a result of a loved one's addiction. So the majority of the chapter kind of centers around this discussion and understanding the dynamics of addiction, understanding principles of treatment, basic principles of treatment, and also understanding recovery to some degree and treatment for recovery. So this is definitely not an area I'm an expert in, but it certainly is an area I know a lot about as a family member. So we'll get started with this. I do want to alert you to the fact that I won't be covering the last few pages of the chapter that really just describe certain kinds of drugs and their effects and so on. I think the thing I'm most interested in for you is for you to understand how addiction sort of feels as a crisis. And if you were in a situation where you were talking with somebody who was experiencing a crisis related to addiction, that you felt like you at least understood a little bit about it and you understood what the needs of a client might be. So again, I'm just going to remind you always, always, always remember that at least for now we're trying to use the ABC model of crisis intervention. And so the A part of the model is going to be developing rapport and spending some time creating some communication of your empathy for a person, whether that person is the substance abuser or some loved one of a substance abuser. And then the B is to remember, try to get to the person's beliefs and unlocking the cognitive key, because as I continue to say to you, the belief system of the person who's suffering is really where we can try to help the client with interventions, because they're suffering as a result of their strongest beliefs and their strongest thoughts, and that is such a powerful thing to understand. And then of course the C, as you know, is related to coping mechanisms, understanding what they've done in the past to cope. Certainly in this world of understanding addiction for family members and for people who are living with addiction, the coping is a rich area, a hugely rich area for education. Just to understand new ways of using coping, because for a loved one of someone with a substance use disorder, misuse disorder, and for the person who's actually engaged in that, the coping that they've been using is certainly not helpful for either of those parties. Okay, so that's a good introduction, I think. This is an area of crisis that you will certainly be exposed to if you don't already have experience with this from someone in your life. It's such a common thing in our culture that our author states that 2015 data show that a person dies from excuse me, a drug-induced death, or a person dies a drug-induced death every 15 minutes in our country. This is just a reality that we are all fairly aware of, but you know, until you really are engaged with someone who is living in a substance addiction, the deeper knowledge of how addiction works and how recovery works and how family members' behavior has an impact just really are things that most people don't know. So I would strongly encourage you to engage in some learning related to this, and that is actually how I'm going to structure your test, is to kind of push you into some resources that provide more education. So historically, the misuse of substance has occurred in our country and in the world for millennia, really, but certainly centuries for us. The author, Christy Cannell, mentions that opiates were introduced in the United States in the 1880s. And, you know, in Europe and other countries, certainly in the Far East, we know that opium was a real addictive drug that was used. You might Google opium dens and try to read about that a little bit if you're curious about the history of that. And of course, alcohol has been used in the United States and across the world, in the history of humankind almost. Alcohol has been something that we have had available to us. So even though the American government has tried and tried and tried to have what is called a war on drugs, it is still something that many people get involved with, and then some people develop addiction to. And so it's just something that it's a part of our culture, as you know. As a crisis worker, you will, as I said before, undoubtedly come across clients who are engaged in the misuse of substance, overuse of substance, and their family members. And so I hope this lecture at least opens up the door for you to think about this in a different way than just kind of the basic stuff that you already know. You can really help loved ones learn to cope with a substance use disorder as a family. Some of the referrals and understandings that you can help a crisis client get to could be a great relief to them as they try to live with somebody who's just suffering with addiction. What might trigger a substance abuse crisis? Well, the person using will probably have one of several types of crises involved, or get involved with one of several types of crises. We're going to talk about those in a minute, but certainly a legal crisis can occur. Health crisis can be a part of this picture, employment crisis or unemployment crisis, and definitely a crisis within a person's family or relationship can all be sort of places where crisis intervention might really just need to happen. It is important to note that the person with a substance use disorder is almost never really motivated to change until they are. And so in the world of substance and recovery, often people say the phrase, "I just had to get sick and tired of feeling sick and tired." And really only then will a person who's living in active addiction have a motivation to do any kind of changing. And in the textbook, Christy Cannell mentions that, kind of in addition to that, when a person who's living in addiction has to face severe consequences for their addictive life, they might be at a place where they would want to make a change or engage in treatment. And really almost only then will a person want to change what they're doing, quite frankly. So the severe consequences are often thought to be necessary to cause what is also called reaching rock bottom or bottoming out. You might have heard these phrases before. This is similar to the idea of just being sick and tired of feeling sick and tired. And so an example of a family crisis could be where a partner just says, "I can't live with you anymore," or "I can't cover up for you anymore," or "I can't give you any more money," or "You can't live here anymore." Sometimes family members get together, as you know, and with supervision from a specialist do something called an intervention, a family intervention, where everyone in the family comes and confronts the addict, or the substance user, I should say, or substance abuser, with the consequences of their behavior, and with extreme consequences from the family level. Sometimes the abuser just becomes psychologically overwhelmed by the negative effects, and they become ready to change. And certainly this would be very true for someone who had this feeling of just not wanting to live like this anymore. And it does become a pretty miserable existence to live in active addiction, and to such a point that your whole life just becomes kind of shanghaied to the substance that you're addicted to. And so sometimes people definitely do come to their own realization that they just can't live like this anymore. And so there are moments where occasionally people do seek help just on their own, but it is kind of an unusual circumstance, I must say. So the four main types of crisis that might arise and the crisis worker might encounter are, number one, a family crisis, where the spouse or partner or parent or children of the abuser become really just fed up or so fearful that they cannot continue to tolerate the abuser's behavior and the abuser's use. And so this is where a family is, you might meet a family in this particular crisis where someone has kicked the substance abuser out of the house on Christmas Eve, or on any eve or any morning, and where people just finally get to that tipping point where they just have to force a change for themselves, and the change that they're forcing is going to affect the using and abusing nature of the client, the crisis. The substance abuser. This threat of loss of loved ones can sometimes cause enough of a crisis to impel the abuser to seek help or to accept being sent to a treatment program. And certainly the person who is going to be going to a treatment program, or the person who's the substance abuser who's receiving this stop behavior from their loved ones, is going to be in a crisis. And so you might, this whole constellation of family change in terms of tolerating the substance abuse is going to constitute a crisis for everybody, really. A medical crisis can happen in a substance abuser's life. So there are a lot of really serious health impairments that can occur. Overdosing on a drug can be a simple example of a medical crisis, but with long use over many years, people can develop, as you know, damaged livers and heart problems and have strokes and all kinds of other medical outcomes that constitute a crisis that really, really threaten the person's life. And so sometimes an abuser must be hospitalized due to health effects. When an abuser becomes physiologically dependent, meaning that their body, becomes physiologically dependent on certain substances, a process of medical detoxification must be experienced and applied, because a person can't then just withdraw safely from using their drug. People sometimes do it, that is certainly true, but this is often done under medical care in a hospital setting, because people can, suffer from seizures and convulsions if they are physiologically dependent on a drug or alcohol. And this is the kind of thing that really needs to be assessed by medical experts, not someone like me or someone like you. So that's important for you to understand. Other medical crises that I might mention can happen as a result of the abuse of stimulants such as methamphetamine, cocaine, and crack. And these, as you probably know, can lead to seizures and heart attacks. And we've all known stories of, I guess, famous people in our culture who have died from these kinds of medical emergencies because of the use or overuse of these drugs. So hospitalization in itself for drug and alcohol overdose can be another crisis. I mentioned this earlier, and usually this is the kind of thing that happens with teenagers and younger adults. College students often find themselves in the hospital with binge drinking, where they have alcohol poisoning and their stomachs have to be pumped. And this can be certainly a severe emotional crisis for a young person and the young person's family. And then a legal crisis can develop. We all know that, pretty much somebody who's living in active addiction is probably going to lose their license to drive a vehicle, because they are using so constantly that it almost is unthinkable that they wouldn't get in a car and speed or run off the road, or for God's sake, hit somebody and cause a car accident. And so losing someone's license, someone losing their license and having to go to court and being prosecuted for that is definitely going to be a crisis that people who work in the field of substance and recovery deal with every day. I'm sure you know that people, when they're in active addiction, need money to get drugs. I'm going to stop now, and that's my timer.